He wasn't just entertaining. That's too small a word for someone like Frank Worthington. Entertaining suggests control, something measured, something rehearsed. Frank wasn't that. He was chaos dressed as genius. A footballer who didn't just play the game, he bent it, stretched it, made it feel like the rules were optional. And that's where the real story begins. Not with what he did right, but with a question most people avoid asking. What if football didn't fail Frank Worthington? What if it never knew what to do with him in the first place? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Football has always claimed to love artists, but historically, it has only ever truly rewarded discipline. Frank Worthington was not disciplined. He was something far more dangerous. He was free. Born on November 23, 1948, in Shelf, just outside Halifax, in West Yorkshire, he came from the kind of background that usually produces fighters. Working class, tough, grounded. Football wasn't a dream in places like that. It was survival, identity, a way out. But Frank didn't play like a man escaping something. He played like a man who didn't feel trapped at all. When Huddersfield Town picked him up as a teenager, it didn't take long for people to notice that something about him didn't fit the usual mold. He moved differently. Not sharper, not faster, just looser, like he wasn't under pressure, like he didn't care if it worked. That's the key to understanding him. Most players calculate risk. Frank ignored it. By the early 1970s, he wasn't just good, he was unforgettable. The flicks, the back heels, the outrageous attempts that should have failed but didn't. Watching him felt like watching someone test the limits of what football would allow. And then came that moment. August 1974, playing for Leicester City against Ipswich Town. You've probably seen the goal. If you haven't, you've seen clips inspired by it. Chest control, flick, turn, volley, all without the ball touching the ground. It wasn't just skill, it was defiance. That goal didn't ask for approval, it assumed it. And suddenly, the comparisons started. People began mentioning George Best, not lightly, but seriously. Same aura, same unpredictability, same sense that anything could happen when the ball reached their feet. But comparisons like that come with a warning label. Because when football calls you an artist, what it really means is this: you're brilliant, but we don't trust you. And that distrust would quietly define Frank Worthington's career. His international record tells you everything. 8 caps for England national team. 8. For a player of that level, that number doesn't make sense, till you look at who was in charge. Don Revie didn't want improvisation. He wanted control, structure, obedience. He wanted players who followed instructions, not players who rewrote them mid-game. Frank wasn't built for that world. So England didn't reject him loudly. They just didn't pick him. And that's how systems deal with people they don't understand. Not with confrontation, with quiet exclusion. But the bigger turning point, the one that still feels like a fork in the road, came in 1972. Bill Shankly wanted him at Liverpool, not as a gamble, as a centerpiece. A club-record £150,000 transfer was ready. That kind of money meant belief. It meant Shankly saw something in Frank that aligned with greatness. All that stood in the way was a medical. And then it collapsed. High blood pressure, a red flag, a hesitation. Shankly, famously stubborn, gave him another chance, sent him to Mallorca. Rest, recover, reset. But here's where the narrative usually turns into a punchline. Frank didn't come back rested. He came back, more like himself. The deal died. And Liverpool went on to dominate the decade league titles. European success, a dynasty. So here's the uncomfortable question again. Did Frank Worthington miss Liverpool? Or did Liverpool miss something they couldn't control? Because imagine that team, built on discipline and structure, suddenly adding chaos into the mix. Would it have worked? Or would it have broken everything? We'll never know. And that's what makes it so compelling. Frank moved on. Different clubs, different cities, over 20 in total. Bolton Wanderers, Birmingham City, and many more. On paper, that looks like instability, but look closer, and it starts to look like something else. Refusal to become predictable. Refusal to settle into a version of himself that felt smaller than what he knew he could be. Yes, there was a lifestyle. The stories are well known. The nights, the headlines, the sense that Frank lived at a pace most people couldn't sustain. But here's the part people don't say out loud. That lifestyle didn't exist separately from his football. It came from the same place. The same instinct that made him attempt impossible goals is the one that made him live without breaks. You can't isolate the genius and condemn the rest. They were connected. And yet, Football has always tried to do exactly that. Take the brilliance, reject the personality. By the time he reached the later stages of his career, something else started to become clear. Not decline in ability, he was still playing into his late 30s, which in itself was remarkable, but a shift in purpose. He wasn't just playing for joy anymore. He was playing to sustain a life that had no off switch. And here's where the conversation turns from romantic to real. Players from that era didn't earn what modern players earn. Not even close. No massive contracts, no sponsorship empires, no financial insulation. Frank Worthington wasn't an exception. He was the rule. And when the game ended, there wasn't a system waiting to catch him. So he adapted. Speaking events, storytelling, recreating the magic in words instead of movement. And he was good at it. Of course he was. Because performance was never the problem. But beneath all of that sits a deeper contradiction. Football celebrated what he gave it, but it wasn't built to protect what he became. And then, years later, came the part no one could perform through. In 2016, his daughter revealed he was suffering from Alzheimer's disease. And suddenly, the story changed. Because how do you process that? A man defined by memory, presence, personality, losing all three. At first, there was resistance. Denial, not out of arrogance, but identity. When your entire life has been built on who you are in a room, losing that isn't just illness, it's erasure. And the decline wasn't dramatic, it never is. It was slow, repetitive, quiet, stories repeated, moments lost, fragments of the man still visible, but slipping. And here's where the real controversy lies, not in his life, but in how the world responded to its ending. Because while fans remembered the goals, while tributes eventually came, where was the system when it mattered? Where was the support when the costs weren't emotional, but practical? Football, as an industry, had evolved into a billion-pound machine, but many of the men who built its foundation were left navigating the hardest years alone. And that raises a question bigger than Frank Worthington. What does the game owe its past? Because this isn't just about one player, it's about a generation. Players who headed heavy balls, played through conditions modern professionals wouldn't accept, and walked away without the safety nets that exist today. There's growing discussion now about links between football and cognitive decline. Repeated headers, long-term impact. Research is ongoing, but the pattern is hard to ignore. And Frank becomes part of that conversation, not as a symbol of tragedy, but as a reminder of reality. That brilliance has a cost, and sometimes that cost is delayed. He passed away on March 22, 2021, in Huddersfield, the place where it all began. And when he did, the tributes were loud, emotional, sincere, but also late, because appreciation in football often works like this. It arrives when it no longer needs to change anything. So how should we see Frank Worthington? As a cautionary tale? That's too simple. As a wasted talent? That's not accurate either. He wasn't wasted. He was experienced. Fully, completely, unapologetically. Maybe the better way to understand him is this. He was a question football never answered. A player who proved that the game isn't just about systems, tactics, or discipline. It's also about expression, risk, imperfection, and maybe the real discomfort comes from this. If you remove everything that made Frank Worthington difficult, you might also remove everything that made him unforgettable. So no, this isn't a story about a man who got it wrong. It's a story about a game that still doesn't know how to handle people who don't fit neatly inside it.